The world loves stories of glittering rises, fairy tale romances, and empires built on charm, but it also cannot look away when those very empires begin to crumble from within. Meghan Markle's life has always played out like a Hollywood script, the ambitious young actress who left behind a modest upbringing to chase fame, the woman who stunned the world by capturing the heart of a prince, and the royal outsider who tried to rewrite the rules of one of the oldest institutions in the world. Yet for every carefully curated narrative Meghan put forward, there were always whispers of another side to the story, shadows that never quite aligned with the dazzling spotlight she so masterfully commanded. Those shadows have now come to light in the most unexpected way, through the voice of her own mother, Doria Ragland. And in the ruthless world of media and billion-dollar streaming deals, that voice has proven strong enough to bring down everything Meghan had built with Netflix. Imagine this. Cameras flashing, Meghan striding confidently across a red carpet, the Netflix partnership looming behind her like a crown jewel of her independence. It was supposed to be her ticket to lasting relevance outside of the palace gates, the proof that she could be more than just a duchess in exile. Netflix poured money and faith into her vision, selling audiences the promise of authenticity and raw truth from inside the royal machine. But truth, as the public is now realizing, may have been the very thing missing from those glossy productions. Doria Ragland, the woman Meghan has often credited as her rock, the quiet, yoga-teaching mother who stayed largely out of royal drama, has allegedly turned the tables. In conversations with investigative author Tom Bower, she unearthed secrets that not only contradicted Meghan's stories, but exposed the very foundation of her Netflix empire as built on shaky ground. When your own mother's revelations collide with the world's most notorious royal biographer, the outcome is bound to be explosive. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The introduction of this saga begins with betrayal, not by a friend, a palace insider, or a distant relative, but by the one person Meghan trusted above all. For years, Doria played the part of the supportive mother, showing up at key events, from the wedding watched by billions to the quiet appearances that painted her as dignified and reserved. Meghan used her as a symbol of strength and resilience, a counterbalance to the strained relationship she had with her father, Thomas Markle. But now, the woman who once represented unconditional loyalty is said to have handed over hair-raising secrets that no PR machine could spin away. For Tom Bower, whose pen has cut deeper than any tabloid headline, Doria's revelations were not just juicy details, they were dynamite. And for Netflix, who had gambled millions on Meghan's brand of unfiltered storytelling, those revelations spelled the end of an already fragile partnership. To understand the weight of this betrayal, one must go back to Meghan's Netflix dream. She was no stranger to scripts, to the idea of crafting compelling drama for public consumption. With Harry by her side, she pitched projects that promised to humanize them, to bring audiences into their world of struggle, resilience, and reinvention. It was marketed as their chance to speak their truth. But what happens when that truth is later exposed as fabricated, when narratives that captured global attention turn out to be little more than performances? Doria's disclosures, according to insiders, struck at the heart of this very question. They suggested that whole storylines were exaggerated, events twisted for sympathy, and timelines manipulated for maximum dramatic impact. If true, these were not just harmless embellishments, but calculated moves designed to sell Meghan as a victim of a cruel monarchy and misunderstood world. Netflix banked on these stories as real, and that's where the trouble began. The middle of this tale brings us to Tom Bower's role. Known for tearing apart public figures with surgical precision, Bower has a reputation for never holding back. His books on the royals have been described as brutal, unsparing, and alarmingly detailed. Meghan and Harry were already wary of him, dismissing his work as sensationalist. But the twist here is that his latest information didn't come from a disgruntled palace staffer or an anonymous source. It came from Doria herself. For audiences, this was the moment the story shifted from yet another tabloid storm to a betrayal of Shakespearean proportions. Why would Doria speak now? What drove her to entrust Meghan's harshest critic with such damaging accounts? Was it a mother's conscience breaking under the weight of years of secrets, or a deeper rift between mother and daughter that the world never saw? These questions linger, intensifying the drama and fueling speculation that Meghan's perfect Hollywood script was never as perfect as it seemed. And then comes the unraveling. Netflix executives, once dazzled by Meghan's star power, now had to contend with the fallout of credibility being questioned at its core. In the streaming world, authenticity is currency. Audiences expect realness, especially from documentaries and personal stories. If viewers believe they have been misled, trust evaporates overnight. Netflix, already under pressure to justify massive budgets in a competitive market, could not afford the backlash. The whispers of fabricated storylines soon became headlines, and the executives who had signed Meghan's golden deal were left scrambling. Behind closed doors, meetings turned frantic, lawyers were consulted, and the possibility of walking away from Meghan became less of a rumor and more of an inevitability. In the span of weeks, the crown jewel of Meghan's post-royal career was at risk of shattering. What makes this story truly gripping is not just the business collapse, but the human fallout. Meghan has built her narrative around loyalty, resilience, and family. She has portrayed herself as a survivor, backed unconditionally by her mother. To lose that very foundation in such a public way is not just a professional disaster, but a deeply personal wound. Imagine the isolation of realizing that your closest confidant has become the reason your empire is crumbling. For Meghan, this was not just the end of a Netflix deal. It was the implosion of the story she had carefully woven for years. For Doria, it was the weight of truth, perhaps too heavy to carry silently any longer. By the end of this introduction, the audience is left standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down at the chaos that follows. The betrayal of a daughter by her mother. The exposure of fabrications in a world that demands truth. The collapse of a streaming empire that was supposed to secure Meghan's legacy. The questions now hang in the air. What exactly were those secrets? Why did Doria choose to speak now? How will Meghan rebuild from such a devastating blow? The answers are what the rest of this story will unravel, piece by piece, in a journey filled with shock, betrayal, and the high cost of playing with the truth. Every empire begins with a vision, and Meghan Markle's was no different. Long before her name was etched into global headlines and her face appeared on the covers of glossy magazines alongside a prince, Meghan had always carried with her a dream of recognition, of influence, of walking into rooms where people turned their heads not because of her royal ties, but because of her own power. Hollywood was the first stage upon which she attempted to build this dream. From the very start, Meghan understood the allure of the spotlight and the currency of stories. She had tasted the instability of growing up with a fractured family, watched her parents' separation, and lived the reality of striving for success in an industry where only a fraction of hopefuls ever see their name in lights. This early struggle didn't discourage her. Instead, it hardened her resolve. If anything, those years convinced her that she would not accept obscurity. She wanted more, much more. Her acting career began like many others. Bit parts, auditions that ended in rejection, casting directors who looked at her as though she were disposable. Meghan knew she wasn't going to be the next ingenue who walked into Hollywood and became an overnight sensation. She had to work at it, had to fight for every role, every line, every second on screen. When Suits came along, it wasn't just a paycheck. It was proof that she could carve out a place for herself in an unforgiving industry. Playing Rachel Zane gave her a foothold, a role that made her recognizable, though still far from the household name she desired. For Meghan, Suits was a ladder, but it wasn't the summit. The summit would require something bigger, a story that went beyond scripted television, one that placed her at the center of cultural conversations. Enter Netflix. The streaming giant represented everything Meghan wanted her future to be: powerful, global, boundary-breaking. Unlike traditional Hollywood studios, Netflix was rewriting the rules. It wasn't just about producing shows or films. It was about capturing movements, shaping narratives, and reaching millions of households across every corner of the world. Meghan saw the writing on the wall. Streaming was the future, and aligning herself with that future would not just cement her relevance, but potentially elevate her to a level she had never achieved as an actress. She wasn't just another performer now. She was a duchess, and duchesses didn't pitch small. They pitched empires. When she and Prince Harry sat down with Netflix executives for the first time, Meghan wasn't presenting herself as an actress. She was presenting herself as a visionary. Archwell Productions wasn't just a company. It was the vessel of their truth. Meghan had prepared meticulously for this moment. The pitch wasn't simply about content. It was about values, about changing the way people consumed stories. She spoke of authenticity, of bringing audiences into spaces they had never been allowed, of humanizing the very people that tabloids had dehumanized for profit. To the executives, this was irresistible. They weren't just investing in Meghan and Harry as individuals. They were investing in cultural icons whose names carried global attention. Meghan understood the power of packaging, and in that room, she packaged her dream as a cultural revolution. But underneath the polish of her pitch was a deeper hunger. For Meghan, this wasn't only about telling stories. It was about control. Hollywood had never fully embraced her. She had been typecast, sidelined, underestimated. Now, with Netflix, she could set the terms. She could decide what stories to tell, how they would be told, and who the heroes and villains would be. This was more than a partnership. It was her opportunity to finally prove to the world that she was more than a supporting character in someone else's story. She wanted to be the producer, the narrator, the leading woman whose story commanded global attention. And for the first time, the world was listening. The early days of the Netflix deal were filled with optimism. Meghan and Harry announced projects that promised to blend inspiration with revelation. There would be documentaries, scripted dramas, even children's content designed to promote kindness and inclusivity. The press releases painted a picture of a power couple ready to shake up the industry. Fans and critics alike were intrigued. What would Meghan do with a platform so vast, a budget so generous, and a name that still commanded headlines no matter where she went? The possibilities seemed endless, and Meghan leaned into that perception. Public appearances were carefully staged. Interviews framed the deal as a triumph, and Archwell was positioned as the creative force of the future. Yet behind the gloss of announcements and photo ops was the intense pressure of execution. Netflix had invested not only money but trust in Meghan. They expected stories that would resonate with audiences, stories that would justify the tens of millions poured into the deal. For Meghan, this meant reaching deeper than ever before, drawing from her own experiences and struggles to shape content that audiences would believe in. But therein lay the seed of the problem. Meghan had always been skilled at presentation, at crafting a narrative that captured sympathy and admiration. But when that skill began to blur the line between embellishment and reality, the very foundation of her dream began to wobble. Still, in those early days, the cracks were invisible to most. Meghan was glowing, brimming with ideas, sketching out visions for series that promised to be both personal and political. She spoke passionately about women's empowerment, mental health, and social justice. Netflix executives, eager to ride the wave of cultural change, bought into her vision wholeheartedly. They wanted exclusivity, they wanted headlines, and Meghan gave them both. At last, she was no longer just an actress waiting for a role. She was the creator of roles, the writer of narratives, the commander of her own destiny. The Hollywood dream she once chased seemed finally within her grasp. But dreams have a way of colliding with reality. For Meghan, the Netflix deal represented more than professional success. It was her insurance policy, her safeguard against irrelevance after stepping away from the royal family. She knew that the world's fascination with her and Harry wouldn't last forever if they didn't transform that attention into something tangible. Netflix was supposed to be the vehicle for that transformation. It was her chance to prove that she didn't need the crown to matter, that she could stand on her own merit and thrive. The dream was intoxicating. It promised independence, validation, and global reach. But as the world would soon learn, the path Meghan chose to secure that dream was riddled with contradictions, fabrications, and secrets that not even the glittering facade of Hollywood could conceal forever. That is where the story of Meghan's Hollywood dream begins, in ambition, hunger, and the belief that she could bend the world to her narrative. It is a story filled with soaring hope, dazzling opportunities, and the intoxicating taste of power. But every dream has a price, and Meghan's would prove to be higher than she ever imagined. In every story of ambition and transformation, there is often a quiet figure standing in the background, a presence that shapes without speaking, observes without interfering, and carries truths that no one else can claim. For Meghan Markle, that figure was her mother, Doria Ragland. For years, the world saw her as the embodiment of calm, the elegant woman who remained dignified even as her daughter's life became a storm of headlines and scrutiny. She wasn't loud, she wasn't confrontational, and she never sought the spotlight in the way others around Meghan seemed to. Doria was the quiet anchor in a sea of chaos, and Meghan leaned on that image to portray herself as grounded, resilient, and tethered to a maternal force of strength. Yet silence, as comforting as it can seem, often hides the weight of unspoken truths. And as the world would eventually discover, Doria's silence was not emptiness, it was observation. From Meghan's earliest days in Los Angeles, Doria had been her guide. She raised her daughter with discipline, independence, and a sense of ambition that extended far beyond the walls of their modest home. She taught Meghan yoga, mindfulness, and resilience, always reminding her that the world would not hand her opportunities. She would have to carve them out herself. It was Doria who encouraged Meghan to pursue her education, to speak up for causes she believed in, and to carry herself with confidence even when the odds were stacked against her. Unlike Meghan's father, Thomas Markle, whose relationship with Meghan became increasingly fractured over time, Doria never challenged her daughter publicly. She stood by her, always just far enough away from the cameras to avoid becoming part of the spectacle, yet close enough to appear whenever her presence was needed most. That balance gave Meghan's story a sense of authenticity. After all, if her mother stood by her side, then surely the world could trust her version of events. But what the world didn't see was the complexity of that silence. To remain a silent witness is not the same as being uninvolved. Doria saw it all. She was there when Meghan first began to craft the story of her struggles. She watched as her daughter presented narratives to the world. Stories of isolation, of being misunderstood, of being victimized by institutions too rigid to accept her. Doria watched as those stories gained traction, as sympathy poured in, and as Meghan transformed her personal experiences into tools for building influence. For a mother, this must have been a complicated role to play. On one hand, she wanted her daughter to succeed, to find the recognition and success she had always dreamed of. On the other hand, she knew where exaggeration began and where reality ended. She carried the intimate knowledge of what was true and what was embellished, what was raw experience, and what was carefully crafted performance. When Meghan married into the royal family, Doria remained an enigma. She was the only member of Meghan's family to attend the wedding, sitting quietly and regally as the world watched. Her absence from interviews, books, and media appearances made her the perfect counterpoint to Thomas Markle's frequent and often embarrassing media outbursts. While Thomas aired grievances on television, Doria's silence was interpreted as loyalty. That contrast made Meghan's narrative stronger. A mother who supported without complaint, and a father who sought attention at his daughter's expense. But behind that narrative, Doria continued to witness, to absorb the unfolding drama, and to keep her thoughts to herself. The world may have thought her silence meant agreement, but silence can just as easily be a shield, protecting the truth from spilling out before its time. As Meghan's partnership with Netflix took shape, Doria became a symbol in Meghan's storytelling. She was mentioned often in interviews as a source of wisdom and grounding. Meghan invoked her mother's strength as part of her brand, presenting her as an inspiration for her resilience against critics. To audiences, this image was compelling. It suggested that Meghan's authenticity was rooted in a real and grounded upbringing, not a manufactured persona. Netflix, too, leaned into this framing. They saw Doria's presence, her quiet dignity, as part of the package they were buying. After all, what could be more convincing than the silent support of a mother who had nothing to gain? But what no one outside the family understood was the burden that came with that silence. Over time, the weight of what Doria knew grew heavier. She had seen the contradictions between Meghan's private life and the public narrative. She knew which stories had been polished into something shinier than reality. She had been present for moments that were later retold in ways that didn't quite match the truth. And she remained silent, watching as those narratives grew bigger, watching as they were broadcast to millions through Netflix's vast platform. For Doria, silence may have once been loyalty. But loyalty, when stretched too thin, can become a form of complicity. The turning point for Doria came not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of years of observation. A mother's love can shield, but it can also suffocate when it collides with conscience. Imagine being the one person who knows the entire story, who knows what was embellished for dramatic effect and what was left unsaid to craft a certain image. At some point, silence is no longer protective, it becomes unbearable. For Doria, the Netflix deal, with its global reach and massive budget, may have been the breaking point. To watch her daughter build a career on what she believed were fabrications was one thing. To watch those fabrications amplified on a scale that influenced millions was another. That is when silence turned into action. Tom Bauer, with his reputation for unearthing hidden truths, became the outlet for Doria's burden. It is difficult to say whether she approached him out of guilt, frustration, or a sense of duty to the truth. But what is clear is that when she finally spoke, the impact was seismic. Doria, the woman who had been framed as Meghan's rock, revealed herself as something far more complex. The silent witness who had chosen, at last, to break her silence. And in doing so, she shifted the entire story. For Meghan, this shift was catastrophic. The very silence she had depended on to validate her narrative was gone. The person she had counted on to never contradict her had spoken, and her words carried more weight than any critic, journalist, or royal insider ever could. For the world, Doria's revelations weren't just gossip, they were testimony. They came from the one person Meghan had always held up as beyond reproach. And for Netflix, the company that had bet millions on Meghan's promise of truth-telling, Doria's voice introduced doubt that could not be ignored. This chapter in Meghan's story is not just about betrayal. It is about the danger of underestimating silence. Silence can appear to be loyalty, but it is often simply patience. Doria's patience had run out. She had been the silent witness for too long, and when she finally chose to speak, her words became the most powerful weapon in unraveling the empire her daughter had built. When Meghan Markle and Prince Harry announced their landmark deal with Netflix, the world reacted with equal parts awe, skepticism, and curiosity. Here were two figures who had walked away from the most famous royal family on earth, standing on their own with promises of independence, yet still commanding headlines and fortunes. To many, the Netflix deal was the ultimate symbol of their success outside the palace walls. It was proof that they didn't need the monarchy to matter, they had Hollywood. But beneath the glitter of the announcement and the carefully chosen words of press releases, the deal was more than just a contract. It was a gamble, a wager that Meghan and Harry could translate their celebrity into cultural relevance and financial stability on a scale no royal outsider had ever achieved before. Netflix was in a unique place when Meghan and Harry walked into the picture. The streaming giant had already revolutionized the way people consumed entertainment, but it was under growing pressure to keep audiences engaged. Rivals like Disney+, Amazon Prime, and Apple TV Plus were pouring billions into their own content. Subscribers wanted not just entertainment, but stories that felt raw, human, and world-shaping. Meghan and Harry seemed to offer all of that. They were real-life royalty turned rebels, living embodiments of both glamour and controversy. From Netflix's perspective, their story wasn't just worth telling, it was worth investing in. For Meghan, the deal was the culmination of everything she had longed for. Hollywood had never fully embraced her as an actress, but now she had a way back into the industry, not as someone waiting to be cast, but as someone dictating what would be made. She was no longer standing in line for auditions. She was sitting at the table with executives who were eager to hear her vision. For Harry, the deal offered financial independence and a way to support causes he cared about. But for Meghan, it was personal. This was her chance to rewrite the script of her life, to tell her story on her terms, and to control the narrative that the British tabloids had twisted against her. The early promises of the Netflix partnership were ambitious. Documentaries that would shed light on untold human stories. Inspirational children's programming that would reflect values of kindness, diversity, and hope. Projects that blended entertainment with activism. It was framed as a cultural mission, a way to change the world through storytelling. Archwell Productions, the vehicle for this mission, was announced with fanfare. Meghan and Harry spoke of creating content that would uplift and inspire, that would move beyond gossip and spectacle into something meaningful. And audiences wanted to believe it. After all, who wouldn't be intrigued by the idea of a royal couple stepping into the role of cultural producers, shaping global narratives from their new home in California? But even as the ink dried on the deal, questions lingered. Would Meghan and Harry deliver content that justified the massive investment? Could they sustain interest beyond the initial headlines? The gamble wasn't just theirs, it was Netflix's too. In an industry where viewer trust and loyalty can evaporate overnight, the pressure to produce content that resonates is immense. Every dollar must translate into subscriber retention or growth. Netflix wasn't paying for Meghan and Harry's titles. They were paying for their names, their ability to draw in audiences. That meant the stories had to be compelling, truthful, and magnetic. In the beginning, Netflix executives were hopeful. Meghan's pitches sounded powerful. She spoke passionately about female empowerment, about revealing the hidden struggles behind glossy public images, about giving voices to those who had been silenced. She positioned herself as both the subject and the creator, someone uniquely placed to tell these stories because she had lived them. The executives were dazzled, not just by her confidence, but by the cultural moment she represented. Meghan and Harry had stepped away from the palace in what had been dubbed Megxit, and the world couldn't stop talking about it. The timing was perfect, but therein lay the danger of the gamble. Netflix wasn't just betting on Meghan and Harry's potential as producers, they were betting on their personal stories. They needed those stories to hold weight, to resonate with viewers in ways that kept them glued to the screen. That meant every detail had to be authentic, every revelation had to feel real. And that's where the cracks began to show. Because while Meghan was a skilled storyteller, the line between her truth and dramatic embellishment was not always clear. The gamble grew riskier as production meetings turned into discussions about how to frame certain narratives. Meghan wanted the world to see her struggles, to understand the isolation and cruelty she had faced. She wanted viewers to empathize with her resilience, to see her as a woman who had been wronged and who had risen above it. But in doing so, storylines became polished, details were shifted, and anecdotes were adjusted for maximum impact. In Hollywood, this is common practice. Drama sells. But in the realm of documentaries and truth-based storytelling, these embellishments become dangerous. For Netflix, it wasn't just about producing content. It was about maintaining credibility with millions of subscribers. The gamble reached its peak with the release of their high-profile projects. While some audiences sympathized, others began to question the authenticity of what they were seeing. Critics accused Meghan of exaggerating, of framing events in ways that suited her narrative while leaving out inconvenient truths. The word fabrication began to appear in headlines. Netflix executives, once confident, started to feel the pressure of defending their investment. Were they complicit in selling audiences a version of reality that didn't hold up under scrutiny? For Meghan, these criticisms were more than professional challenges. They struck at the heart of her dream. The Netflix deal wasn't just about making content. It was about proving that she could command her own narrative. Every accusation of fabrication was a direct threat to her credibility. Every doubt raised by critics chipped away at the foundation she had built. And when the doubts began to spread, Netflix had to make a choice. Continue to support Meghan's vision at the risk of their own reputation, or quietly distance themselves before the damage became too great. That was the true nature of the gamble. The risk that the very stories meant to secure Meghan's legacy could become the reason her empire collapsed. The Netflix deal was more than a contract. It was a lifeline, a chance to prove that she was more than a duchess, more than a tabloid figure, more than a former actress. But every gamble has winners and losers, and Meghan's Hollywood bet was about to collide with forces she never anticipated, including the voice of her own mother. At the heart of Meghan Markle's Netflix empire was a promise, the promise of truth. When she and Harry announced their production partnership, they framed it as a chance to tell authentic stories, to peel back the polished surface of royal life, and to offer something deeper than what tabloids had ever delivered. The press releases spoke of honesty, rawness, and transparency. But as time went on, the foundation of those promises began to crack. Viewers and insiders alike started noticing inconsistencies, and whispers grew into headlines suggesting that much of the content wasn't as genuine as it claimed to be. The very word that haunted Meghan throughout her career, fabrication, was now tied directly to her most ambitious project. The early warning signs were subtle. In interviews promoting the projects, Meghan often repeated anecdotes that seemed rehearsed, as though they had been carefully polished for maximum emotional impact. Audiences familiar with her earlier statements noticed that details shifted depending on the context. A story about feeling isolated in the royal family changed slightly from one retelling to the next. A claim about being silenced was contradicted by evidence of public appearances. In the fast-paced world of media, these inconsistencies might have been overlooked. But when the stakes involve millions of dollars and a platform as vast as Netflix, they become magnified. One of the first projects under Archwell Productions was intended to spotlight the struggles of women balancing family and public life. Meghan positioned herself as a prime example, drawing on her experiences as both a working mother and a public figure. But critics pointed out that her narrative leaned heavily into dramatization. Moments that were painted as lonely and crushing were juxtaposed with photographs showing her engaged in public events or surrounded by staff. It wasn't that she hadn't faced challenges. It was that the challenges were exaggerated to the point of distortion. What should have been a documentary grounded in truth became, in the eyes of many, a melodrama dressed up as reality. The term fabricated storylines began circulating within industry circles. It referred not only to Meghan's personal accounts, but also to the way stories from others were woven into her projects. Insiders whispered that anecdotes had been edited out of context, timelines rearranged, and narratives bent to fit a dramatic arc rather than reflecting what actually happened. For Netflix, this was troubling. Documentaries thrive on authenticity. The audience comes for stories that are real, not staged. If they suspect manipulation, they disengage, and disengagement translates to cancellations and losses for a streaming giant. Netflix executives began quietly questioning Meghan's approach. In private meetings, concerns were raised about fact-checking. Production staff reported pressure to frame stories in a way that aligned with Meghan's vision, even if the reality was more mundane. When a producer suggested including footage that contradicted one of Meghan's claims, it was allegedly dismissed as off-message. Over time, a pattern emerged. Meghan's productions weren't just about telling stories. They were about reinforcing an image, her image, at all costs. This tension between truth and narrative came to a head when viewers began publicly calling out contradictions. Social media users compiled side-by-side comparisons of Meghan's statements, highlighting the differences. Articles surfaced questioning whether events described in her projects had happened at all. Some journalists went further, digging into archives to expose inconsistencies. What had been presented as moments of despair or betrayal sometimes didn't align with documented timelines. The backlash grew, and Netflix was forced into a defensive position. To understand why these fabrications mattered so much, one has to look at the broader context. Meghan's Netflix deal wasn't just another celebrity vanity project. It was sold as a cultural milestone, a chance to reshape public discourse about power, privilege, and resilience. If the narratives at its core were exposed as exaggerated or untrue, the entire mission unraveled. What began as a bold statement about truth-telling became an indictment of manipulation. For Netflix, the damage wasn't limited to Meghan. It threatened the credibility of their entire documentary division, a cornerstone of their global strategy. Behind the scenes, executives grew increasingly uneasy. The deal had been a gamble, and now it was looking like a liability. Leaked memos revealed concerns about narrative integrity and audience trust. Staff members reportedly debated whether to pull back on Meghan's projects or double down and hope the storm passed. But as the whispers grew louder, a new development made the storm impossible to ignore. Meghan's own mother, Doria Ragland, had begun sharing information with Tom Bower that contradicted key elements of Meghan's Netflix storylines. This was more than damaging. It was devastating. Until then, Meghan could dismiss critics as biased or tabloids as malicious. But how could she dismiss her own mother? Doria's revelations didn't just question the narratives, they shattered them. They suggested that entire storylines Netflix had paid for were built not on reality, but on invention. For Meghan, it wasn't just about losing credibility with the public. It was about losing the trust of the very company that had bet millions on her brand. The consequences of these fabrications were immediate. Netflix, already under fire for spending heavily on projects that didn't deliver, faced renewed scrutiny from shareholders. Critics accused the company of prioritizing celebrity over substance. Internal confidence in Meghan's productions eroded. Some staffers reportedly described the deal as a mistake in hindsight. And for Meghan, whose Hollywood dream depended on the success of her Netflix partnership, the unraveling of these storylines signaled the collapse of the empire she had worked so hard to build. This chapter marks the turning point. Fabricated storylines were no longer whispers, but headlines. Doria's involvement transformed the situation from rumor into revelation. And the Netflix deal, once heralded as Meghan's ticket to lasting influence, began to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. The gamble had been placed, but the cards on the table revealed a losing hand. In every saga where powerful figures attempt to control the narrative, there eventually comes a challenger who refuses to accept the story at face value. For Meghan Markle, that challenger arrived in the form of Tom Bower, a man whose name alone sends shivers through the ranks of politicians, business leaders, and royals alike. Known as one of the most unflinching biographers of our time, Bower built his reputation on peeling back layers of glamour, exposing uncomfortable truths, and digging into places where others feared to tread. If Meghan's Netflix dream was about crafting the perfect version of her life, Tom Bower's career was about demolishing such versions with merciless precision. And when Doria Ragland chose him as the one to receive her disclosures, Meghan's entire empire shifted from fragile to doomed. To understand the gravity of Bower's involvement, it's necessary to look at his history. He wasn't a gossip columnist chasing salacious headlines. He was a man who had made a career out of writing biographies that were as forensic as they were unforgiving. Bower had investigated prime ministers, tycoons, and royalty, and his books rarely left their subjects unscathed. His methodology was relentless, cross-checking facts, interviewing dozens of sources, poring over records, and pursuing details with almost prosecutorial zeal. His work wasn't always embraced by those he wrote about, but his reputation for accuracy meant his words carried enormous weight. When Tom Bower put his name to a claim, it wasn't dismissed as idle chatter. It was seen as a revelation. For Meghan, Bower had always been a looming adversary. She knew his reputation, knew that his pen could slice through carefully curated images, and knew that his books often left legacies scarred. When he turned his attention to her, she and Harry dismissed him as biased, insisting his accounts were based on hearsay. But privately, there was fear. Fear that his relentless approach could unearth cracks in the narrative she had so carefully maintained. Fear that his focus would shift from critics and palace insiders to the inner circle she had always considered untouchable. What Meghan couldn't have imagined was that her own mother would one day open the door for him, handing over truths that only she could confirm. When word spread that Doria had been in contact with Tom Bower, the reaction was electric. For insiders at Netflix, it was a nightmare scenario. The very foundation of Meghan's productions had already been questioned, but now those questions were being reinforced by one of the most credible investigative writers alive. And the source wasn't an anonymous former staffer or a tabloid journalist. It was Meghan's mother. That combination was devastating. It created a narrative too powerful for Meghan's team to dismiss and too dangerous for Netflix to ignore. If Tom Bower was writing with Doria's voice in his corner, it meant that the cracks in Meghan's storylines could no longer be spun away. For Doria, turning to Bower was an act of release. She had been silent for years, carrying truths that contradicted her daughter's public image. She had watched as Meghan wove those truths into fabrications, and as those fabrications became the basis for multi-million-dollar deals. To her, perhaps, the burden of silence became unbearable. Bower offered her a way to speak without embellishment, a way to finally set the record straight. And once she began to speak, there was no turning back. She confirmed the details that had long been whispered but never proven. She provided context for inconsistencies Meghan had brushed aside. She gave insight into Meghan's past that no one else could. For Tom Bower, this was gold. He wasn't simply uncovering contradictions. He was receiving them directly from the one person who knew Meghan better than anyone else. And unlike critics or estranged relatives, Doria's words carried maternal authority. She wasn't speaking from spite or revenge. She was speaking as someone who had lived the truth alongside her daughter. That distinction made her revelations even more powerful. It also made them impossible for Meghan to dismiss publicly. To call her mother a liar would be to invite a scandal of biblical proportions, one that no PR strategy could contain. The significance of Bauer's entry into the story also lies in timing. Netflix was already growing uneasy about Meghan's productions, facing backlash over the perception of fabricated storylines. Public trust in Meghan's narratives was slipping. And then came Bauer, armed with new material that validated those suspicions. It was the perfect storm. For Netflix executives, the gamble had turned into a crisis. They had to ask themselves, how could they continue to back Meghan when one of the most credible biographers was preparing to expose her? Every dollar they poured into her productions now seemed at risk of being tainted by association with falsehood. The media reaction was swift. Once reports surfaced that Doria had confided in Bauer, journalists sharpened their knives. Headlines speculated about what she might have revealed, each rumor more damaging than the last. Commentators questioned why Doria would choose this moment, and why she would place her trust in Meghan's most feared critic. Public fascination intensified. If Meghan's mother was breaking rank, what did that say about the credibility of her story? And if Tom Bauer was the one documenting it, how much damage could Meghan's reputation withstand? For Meghan herself, this was not just professional fallout, it was personal devastation. She had built her public image on the unwavering support of her mother. She had pointed to Doria as proof of her authenticity, as the one who validated her every claim. To have that very person collaborate with her greatest biographical threat was an act of betrayal that cut deeper than any tabloid article or royal slight. Meghan had fought with her father in public, dismissing him as opportunistic. But she had always been able to point to her mother as the counterweight, the loyal figure who remained above the fray. Now, even that foundation was gone. The entrance of Tom Bauer into Meghan's Netflix story transformed what had been a PR challenge into an existential crisis. Fabricated storylines were no longer speculative accusations. They were being documented with receipts, context, and the voice of someone who could not be dismissed. For Netflix, it was a reputational disaster waiting to happen. For Meghan, it was the collapse of the carefully built wall between her public narrative and her private reality. And for Tom Bauer, it was another chapter in a career defined by bringing the powerful to their knees. This chapter of the saga underscores the fragility of empires built on curated truths. Meghan had believed she could control her story by controlling the medium, that Netflix would be the platform to solidify her version of events forever. But by underestimating the weight of silence carried by her mother, and by dismissing the threat of Tom Bauer, she failed to see the storm gathering at her doorstep. When it finally broke, the combination of Bauer's pen and Doria's voice created a force powerful enough to topple the entire structure. Every story has a breaking point, the moment where whispers transform into undeniable truths and private knowledge becomes a public weapon. For Meghan Markle, that moment arrived with the revelations her mother, Doria Ragland, allegedly shared with Tom Bauer. Until then, suspicions about Meghan's Netflix projects had hovered in the realm of speculation. Critics accused her of exaggeration, insiders muttered about narrative manipulation, and headlines hinted at fabrication. But speculation alone can be dismissed, and Meghan had built a career on deflecting criticism by framing it as bias. What she could not deflect was the intimate knowledge of her own mother. When Doria began to disclose the details she had silently carried for years, the world was confronted with hair-raising secrets that not only undercut Meghan's credibility, but also exposed a side of her life few could have imagined. Doria had always been the quiet constant in Meghan's story. Unlike Meghan's father, Thomas Markle, who spoke frequently and sometimes recklessly to the media, Doria stayed silent. That silence made her powerful. It made her the one voice no one doubted, the one person whose credibility was above reproach. Meghan had leaned on that silence, presenting her mother as her steadfast supporter, her rock, her proof of authenticity. But silence is not emptiness. Doria's silence had been filled with years of observation, years of seeing her daughter shape narratives for personal advantage, and years of watching those narratives diverge from reality. When she finally spoke, the floodgates opened. The first of the alleged secrets struck at the very foundation of Meghan's public persona, her portrayal of herself as isolated and unsupported within the royal family. Meghan had often told stories of feeling abandoned, of being left to navigate the pressures of royal life alone. In her Netflix documentaries and interviews, she painted a picture of suffering in silence, without anyone to turn to. But according to Doria's disclosures, this version of events was not entirely true. She claimed that Meghan had, in fact, been offered support, but often rejected it in favor of controlling the narrative of victimhood. Doria revealed that Meghan exaggerated her loneliness to make her story more compelling, leaving out details that would have shown her as less isolated than she claimed. For viewers who had sympathized with Meghan's tale of abandonment, this was a shocking contradiction. Another secret involved Meghan's accounts of her childhood. In interviews and on-screen moments, Meghan often portrayed her upbringing as financially modest, even struggling, to highlight her resilience. While it is true that Meghan's early years were not lavish, Doria allegedly revealed that the narrative of hardship had been stretched. Meghan's father, Thomas, despite their strained relationship, had given her opportunities many children never had, from private schooling to exposure to Hollywood sets where he worked as a lighting director. By downplaying these advantages and painting a starker picture of hardship, Meghan created a storyline of triumph against all odds. Doria's revelations cast doubt on just how authentic that storyline truly was. But the secrets didn't stop at contradictions of narrative. Some of them were deeply personal, cutting into the very heart of Meghan's relationships. Doria allegedly spoke about moments of manipulation, times when Meghan tailored stories to evoke sympathy or to gain an upper hand in negotiations. These weren't just small adjustments to the truth, they were calculated choices designed to build an image. One example involved Meghan's portrayal of her relationship with the late Queen Elizabeth. In interviews, Meghan described moments of warmth, but also emphasized feelings of exclusion. Doria claimed that Meghan's accounts of exclusion left out significant details of kindness from the Queen, moments that complicated the narrative of rejection. To omit them entirely was to craft a one-sided story. Perhaps the most shocking of Doria's disclosures, however, involved Meghan's approach to the Netflix productions themselves. Doria alleged that entire storylines were created from fragments of truth stretched into full-blown dramatic arcs. Private disagreements became major conflicts on screen. Casual comments were reframed as evidence of systemic hostility. Events that had little consequence in real life were elevated into defining turning points. For Netflix executives, who had trusted that Meghan was delivering raw truth, this was devastating. They had paid for authenticity, but what they got, according to Doria, was performance. The hair-raising nature of these secrets lay not only in their content, but in their source. Anyone else revealing these details could be brushed aside as biased or opportunistic. But coming from Doria, they carried maternal weight. A mother has no incentive to lie about her child. Her words are assumed to come from a place of honesty, even if painful. That made these disclosures impossible to ignore. The world began to question. If Meghan's own mother contradicted her storylines, how much of what Meghan had shared could be trusted? The fallout was swift. Reporters latched onto Doria's revelations, amplifying them across headlines. Social media exploded with debates, as people dissected Meghan's past statements in light of her mother's claims. For supporters, it was a painful moment of doubt. For critics, it was vindication. For Netflix, it was panic. Executives convened emergency meetings to assess the risk. Could they continue to release content under Archwell Productions if its credibility was compromised? Every decision they made now carried the risk of reputational collapse. For Meghan, these secrets weren't just damaging professionally. They were catastrophic personally. She had built her brand around authenticity, around being the woman who spoke truth to power. To be exposed as someone who fabricated elements of her story undermined everything she stood for. Worse, it was her own mother who had dismantled that brand. Doria's decision to speak was a betrayal Meghan could neither anticipate nor easily forgive. In Meghan's mind, she had counted on her mother to always remain in her corner. But in the end, it was Doria's voice that shook the foundations of her empire. This chapter in Meghan's story shows how fragile even the most carefully constructed narratives can be when confronted with the weight of truth. Fabricated storylines may work in the short term, captivating audiences hungry for drama, But when those fabrications are exposed, they unravel not just the story, but the storyteller. And in Meghan's case, the unraveling was amplified by the most unlikely source, the very person she once pointed to as her proof of authenticity. When the dust began to settle after Doria Ragland's revelations, one question dominated the halls of Hollywood and the digital airwaves alike. What would happen to Meghan Markle's Netflix empire? The answer was as swift as it was merciless. Executives, who had once celebrated the acquisition of her multi-million-dollar deal, now faced the stark reality that the cornerstone of their investment might be built on illusions rather than truth. The alleged fabrications exposed by her mother ignited a chain reaction that would change the trajectory of Meghan's streaming ventures forever. Inside Netflix headquarters, the mood was tense. Boardrooms that had previously buzzed with excitement over the potential of new content featuring Meghan's projects were now filled with anxious executives debating damage control. Emails flew back and forth with unprecedented urgency. Legal teams began reviewing contracts for any clauses that could provide an exit strategy. The question was no longer whether the content was entertaining, but whether it was defensible. How could the streaming giant continue to promote series and documentaries if their lead figure was now publicly accused of fabricating her narratives? The implications were immediate. Netflix's stockholders demanded answers. The company had invested tens of millions of dollars into projects promoted as authentic, heartfelt explorations of societal issues and personal journeys. These projects were marketed with Meghan's voice as the seal of credibility. But credibility, once questioned publicly by someone as trusted as Doria, became a liability overnight. Investors feared backlash, not only from subscribers, but also from advocacy groups and watchdog organizations that could challenge the company's claims of truthful programming. Public opinion was similarly unforgiving. Social media platforms became a battleground. Threads dissected every known statement Meghan had made about her experiences, her upbringing, and her challenges. Users compared past interviews and documentaries with Doria's statements, highlighting inconsistencies and questioning the authenticity of entire narratives. Online communities that had previously defended Meghan became arenas of heated debate. Some still attempted to rationalize the discrepancies, suggesting misunderstandings or editorial liberties. Others were merciless, framing the revelations as a direct exposure of deliberate deception. Inside the entertainment industry, whispers spread like wildfire. Agents, producers, and collaborators who had eagerly aligned themselves with Meghan began to distance themselves. Reputation is everything in Hollywood, and now her credibility was under scrutiny. Potential collaborators reconsidered deals. Partners feared association with controversy that could tarnish their own professional standing. Negotiations stalled, deals were frozen, and executives wondered if the next big project would ever see the light of day. The ripple effects of a single disclosure were staggering, reaching far beyond Netflix and into the wider world of entertainment and media. The collapse was not limited to perception. It translated directly into financial consequences. Production schedules were halted, marketing campaigns were paused, and contract clauses allowing Netflix to retract funding came into play. Internal memos reportedly outlined strategies for minimizing financial exposure, including canceling projects, rewriting storylines, or even re-editing footage to remove Meghan's central presence. Every option carried its own cost and risk, but in the wake of Doria's revelations, action was necessary. To Netflix, the risk of continuing without intervention was simply too great. Meanwhile, the media pounced. High-profile outlets ran headlines emphasizing the alleged fabrication of Meghan's narratives, often citing anonymous sources within Netflix or close to the production teams. Tabloid stories flourished with sensationalism, while more measured journalism analyzed the potential breach of trust between content creators and their platform. Experts in media ethics weighed in on the fallout, discussing how authenticity is monetized in the streaming age and how quickly a personal brand can unravel when authenticity is questioned. Every article, every segment, every social media post added to the mounting pressure on Meghan and her team. Amid the chaos, Meghan faced the personal reality of professional collapse. It is one thing to navigate criticism, another entirely to witness a financial empire destabilized because of public exposure. According to reports, she convened private meetings with her advisors, attempting to formulate a plan to salvage her brand. Yet every potential move was complicated by the fact that her own mother had become the source of damage. Familial trust, once presumed untouchable, had been weaponized against her. In the high-stakes world of celebrity and streaming, there is little room for error, and personal relationships can no longer be shielded from public scrutiny. The timing of the revelations exacerbated the situation. Marketing campaigns for upcoming releases had already begun, trailers were circulating, and pre-release press tours had been scheduled. The sudden controversy forced Netflix to reconsider promotional strategies, halting campaigns, and issuing internal directives to avoid public statements that could worsen the perception problem. For a company that relies on anticipation and subscriber excitement, this disruption represented both immediate financial risk and long-term brand damage. Meanwhile, competitors observed the turmoil with calculated interest. Streaming platforms are perpetually in search of new talent and original content, and the faltering of a high-profile figure like Meghan presented both cautionary lessons and potential opportunity. Executives elsewhere noted the fragility of celebrity-driven projects, recognizing that audience engagement can be influenced as much by narrative authenticity as by star power. In the months following the initial revelations, discussions within competing platforms often referenced Meghan's situation as a case study in risk management and crisis response. Doria's alleged disclosures also prompted legal scrutiny. Analysts speculated that contractual agreements between Netflix and Meghan included representations and warranties regarding authenticity. If it were determined that content was knowingly fabricated, questions of breach could arise. Lawyers reportedly reviewed clauses that could potentially allow Netflix to void agreements without incurring substantial financial penalties. The possibility of litigation hung like a shadow over ongoing productions, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty that stifled creativity and delayed decision-making. For the public, the narrative shifted rapidly. What was once a story of resilience and courage became framed as one of misrepresentation. Fans felt betrayed, critics felt justified, and journalists found themselves with an abundance of material to analyze and debate. The perception of Meghan's persona, compassionate, authentic, and courageous, now contended with allegations of manipulation and exaggeration. The contrast between the woman presented on screen and the one portrayed by Doria's disclosures became a focal point of discussion across media platforms. The fallout reached its most decisive moment when Netflix officially reassessed its partnership. Reports suggest that meetings between executives and Meghan's representatives became increasingly tense. The financial stakes were enormous, the public scrutiny intense, and the reputational risk undeniable. Within weeks, Netflix made the decision to cancel or indefinitely postpone several projects, effectively severing the multi-million-dollar deal that had once promised global influence and creative authority. The network had concluded that the cost of continuing outweighed any potential benefit, marking a dramatic conclusion to a high. The Netflix fallout serves as a stark illustration of the delicate balance between celebrity, narrative, and corporate responsibility. In a world where personal stories are monetized and public perception drives both attention and revenue, the line between truth and performance becomes crucial. For Meghan Markle, the collapse of her streaming ventures represents more than financial loss. It is a public reckoning, a moment where credibility and trust intersect with business, personal relationships, and media scrutiny. And at the center of it all is Doria Ragland, whose alleged disclosures created a turning point that no corporate strategy could fully mitigate. Once news of Doria Ragland's revelations and the subsequent Netflix fallout became widespread, the court of public opinion wasted no time in delivering its verdict. Social media exploded with reactions, ranging from shock and disbelief to ridicule and outright condemnation. Hashtags related to Meghan's Netflix deal trended globally, as people dissected every interview, trailer, and press appearance she had ever made. Commentary poured in not only from casual viewers but from media analysts, cultural commentators, and even fellow celebrities, all weighing in on what was rapidly being labeled one of the most dramatic collapses in recent entertainment history. Online platforms became a battlefield. On Twitter, threads stretched for hundreds of posts, chronicling alleged inconsistencies in Meghan's narratives. Reddit communities dedicated to royal affairs and entertainment gossip dissected her projects scene by scene, comparing her public statements to Doria's account. Users highlighted moments that now seemed suspect, questioning whether certain stories were embellished for dramatic effect or completely fabricated. Some posts went viral overnight, sparking debates across platforms that reached millions of viewers. It became clear that the perception of Meghan as a storyteller had been irrevocably altered. Traditional media joined the frenzy. News outlets ran continuous coverage, each attempting to outdo the other with the most provocative headline or exclusive insight. Morning shows and evening news segments replayed clips of her documentaries and Netflix specials, overlaying commentary that framed the work as deceptive or misleading. Talk shows invited experts to discuss the implications of a celebrity-driven platform potentially promoting content that could be construed as fabricated. Legal analysts examined the fallout in depth, speculating on contractual breaches and financial ramifications for both Meghan and Netflix. Public sentiment was divided, but the negative coverage dominated the narrative. Some former fans expressed feelings of betrayal, claiming that they had emotionally invested in stories they now viewed as false. Online comment sections became flooded with pointed critiques, questioning not only Meghan's credibility, but also her moral and ethical judgment. How could someone manipulate their audience like this? One viral comment read, echoing the frustration of thousands who felt deceived. Memes circulated rapidly, mocking both the alleged fabrications and the resulting chaos. Social media platforms, once a source of support and amplification, had turned into arenas of scrutiny and ridicule. In addition to the public, cultural commentators began to weigh in. Articles exploring the societal implications of fabricated narratives in high-profile media projects appeared in major publications. Experts in media ethics discussed how audiences are conditioned to trust stories that appear authentic, and how the revelation of falsehoods can cause not only disappointment, but also a crisis of trust in media institutions. The case of Meghan Markle became a cautionary tale cited in panels, podcasts, and webinars focused on integrity in storytelling and the responsibilities of celebrity influence. Meanwhile, traditional royal circles were abuzz with conversations about reputational impact. Though distant from the direct fallout at Netflix, palace insiders reportedly watched the media storm with keen interest, analyzing the ways public perception could influence broader narratives about the family. Gossip columns speculated on internal reactions from other members of the royal family, pondering whether Meghan's credibility crisis might affect future engagements, charitable partnerships, or public appearances. Every statement made by Doria Ragland was scrutinized for its potential ripple effects on both her daughter's personal brand and the royal image. The public backlash also intersected with financial considerations beyond Netflix. Sponsorships, partnerships, and planned appearances all faced reevaluation. Brands wary of controversy began to distance themselves, reassessing contracts and marketing plans that relied on Meghan's endorsement or participation. The perceived damage to her personal brand was no longer an abstract concern. It translated directly into lost opportunities, stalled projects, and diminished marketability. Business advisors reportedly warned that recovering from such a high-profile credibility crisis would require significant effort and strategic planning, possibly over years rather than months. Fans who continued to support Meghan found themselves navigating a challenging social landscape. Defenders posted side-by-side comparisons of her work and Doria's statements, arguing that the revelations might be misinterpreted or exaggerated. Some highlighted the pressures of public life, the scrutiny of the media, and the inherent challenges of celebrity storytelling. Nevertheless, these voices were often drowned out by the prevailing narrative of betrayal and deception. The momentum of public opinion had shifted, and reversing it seemed increasingly difficult as every new report and social media post reinforced the perception of crisis. International audiences added another layer of complexity. News coverage extended beyond the United States and the United Kingdom, reaching Europe, Asia, and the Americas. International fans expressed disappointment and curiosity, while media outlets translated the controversy for global consumption, sometimes emphasizing different aspects depending on cultural perspectives. In countries where Meghan's humanitarian work had previously been highlighted, the narrative shifted to question the authenticity of her advocacy. This global scrutiny amplified the intensity of the backlash, making it a multifaceted crisis that transcended borders and demographics. Amid the public outrage, some experts began to explore the psychological dimensions of the situation. Commentators on media ethics, celebrity psychology, and public relations noted the power of trust and the speed at which it can be eroded. They discussed the dangers inherent in blending personal narratives with corporate partnerships, particularly when audiences are encouraged to form emotional connections with stories presented as authentic. Meghan's case became a textbook example of how quickly credibility can erode and how profoundly public opinion can influence both personal and professional outcomes. The backlash also prompted responses from the broader entertainment industry. Agents, producers, and fellow content creators publicly commented on the importance of authenticity in storytelling, often indirectly referencing Meghan's situation without naming her. Industry panels discussed the risks associated with celebrity-driven projects, emphasizing the need for transparency and ethical responsibility. Insider perspectives revealed that Hollywood operates on trust networks, and once credibility is questioned, even the most high-profile figures can find doors closed and opportunities withdrawn. As the days turned into weeks, the intensity of the backlash did not abate. Instead, it evolved. New interviews, leaked statements, and additional commentary from Doria Ragland or secondary sources continued to feed the narrative. Each revelation or clarification sparked renewed discussion, creating a feedback loop in which public opinion and media coverage reinforced one another. For Meghan, navigating this environment became increasingly complex, as any statement or action risked being interpreted in the context of the ongoing controversy. Ultimately, the public backlash served as both a reflection and a magnifier of the underlying issues. It highlighted the precariousness of celebrity credibility, the interconnectedness of personal and professional reputation, and the speed at which narratives can shift in the digital age. For Meghan Markle, the backlash was not merely a matter of hurt feelings or criticism. It was a tangible force that reshaped her professional prospects, influenced public perception, and underscored the fragile nature of trust in a world that consumes information voraciously and judges quickly. The shockwaves from the Netflix deal collapse were not confined to public opinion or social media chatter. Within the glittering corridors of Hollywood, a more calculated and strategic reckoning was taking place. Executives at Netflix convened emergency meetings to assess the damage, the financial implications, and the potential legal ramifications. Though the streaming giant had experienced controversies before, this situation was uniquely perilous because it involved both a high-profile celebrity with a global following and content that had been heavily marketed as authentic storytelling. Inside the boardrooms, discussions were tense. Financial analysts presented projections showing how the loss of Meghan Markle's projects could impact subscriber engagement and revenue streams. Marketing teams dissected every promotional campaign, every teaser, and every trailer associated with her Netflix productions, identifying moments that could now be criticized or deemed misleading. Legal advisors flagged clauses in contracts that might allow Netflix to terminate agreements without incurring significant penalties, while simultaneously preparing for the inevitable media scrutiny that would accompany any public statement. The atmosphere was one of urgent damage control, as executives tried to navigate the delicate balance between protecting the company and managing the reputational fallout of a celebrity-driven project gone awry. Hollywood insiders described the situation as a cautionary tale with immediate consequences. Agents representing other talent began reevaluating deals, wondering how closely they should scrutinize the content and behavior of the celebrities they represented. Some production companies paused or canceled collaborations out of concern for reputational risk, recognizing that association with a scandal of this magnitude could have a long-lasting impact on their brands. The ripple effects were tangible. Projects unrelated to Meghan Markle but connected to the network or platform faced renewed scrutiny, as both audiences and industry players questioned the credibility and ethical standards of their creative output. Meanwhile, discussions behind closed doors explored the implications for casting, co-productions, and future partnerships. Executives debated whether to distance themselves entirely from any projects associated with Meghan, or whether to attempt a measured approach that allowed for rehabilitation of her public image over time. PR strategists crafted hypothetical messaging, outlining potential responses for interviews, press releases, and media statements. The challenge was monumental. Every word, every appearance, and every decision could be dissected for missteps, and the stakes were heightened by the global attention the controversy had garnered. The influence of this internal Hollywood fallout extended beyond corporate concerns. Directors, producers, and writers began revisiting projects that had initially included Meghan in key roles. Scripts were revised, schedules rearranged, and some collaborations quietly shelved. For creative professionals, the unpredictability of celebrity involvement was now a stark reminder of the delicate interplay between personal branding and professional opportunity. The incident became a topic of conversation at industry gatherings, cocktail events, and private lunches, as insiders debated whether the fallout represented a rare miscalculation or a larger trend in celebrity media accountability. Agents and managers also faced intense scrutiny from clients. High-profile talent often relies on representatives to guide career decisions, and in this climate of uncertainty, every recommendation carried additional weight. Some agents reportedly advised clients to take a temporary hiatus, rebrand themselves, or pivot to projects with less public scrutiny. Others emphasized transparency and authenticity as the guiding principles for avoiding similar crises. In many ways, the collapse of Meghan Markle's Netflix deal became a touchstone for industry-wide discussions about risk management, audience perception, and the moral responsibilities of celebrity-driven content. Critics of the entertainment industry noted that the situation revealed systemic vulnerabilities. A celebrity's charisma, personal narrative, or public influence can carry a project, sometimes overshadowing traditional vetting, fact-checking, or creative oversight. When those narratives are later challenged, the consequences extend far beyond one individual, affecting teams of writers, producers, editors, marketing professionals, and executives. The Meghan Markle debacle served as a case study in how quickly a high-profile platform can be destabilized when questions of authenticity arise. Beyond corporate circles, Hollywood gossip columns and entertainment news outlets ran exhaustive analyses. Interviews with anonymous insiders offered tantalizing glimpses of the decision-making process at Netflix, while commentary pieces debated the ethical implications of a celebrity's storytelling. Comparisons were drawn to other high-profile controversies, examining similarities and differences in how audiences, media, and corporations respond. While some coverage emphasized accountability and professional responsibility, other narratives leaned into scandal, emphasizing drama and speculation over verified facts. At the same time, casting directors and producers became increasingly cautious in their selection of talent for high-profile projects. The fallout from Meghan's Netflix deal prompted discussions about contractual safeguards, vetting procedures, and clauses designed to protect production companies from similar crises. Decisions were no longer based solely on star power or audience appeal. Considerations about reliability, credibility, and public perception became equally critical. The incident underscored the delicate balance between leveraging celebrity influence and maintaining the integrity of creative projects. For those within the industry who admired Meghan's ambition and creativity, the developments were sobering. Conversations at private events reflected a mix of empathy and pragmatism. While some sympathized with the pressures she faced in navigating public scrutiny, others emphasized that transparency and truthfulness were non-negotiable in professional collaborations. The incident served as a lesson that personal narratives, while powerful, must be grounded in reality if they are to sustain long-term credibility and professional success. The Hollywood fallout extended even to ancillary industries connected to entertainment. Publicists, social media strategists, brand consultants, and event coordinators all re-examined the potential risks of working with high-profile clients whose narratives could be questioned. Panels at conferences highlighted the Meghan Markle situation as an example of the importance of crisis management, audience engagement, and the potential consequences of perceived deception. Discussions about ethical storytelling, corporate responsibility, and celebrity accountability became central topics of conversation in a variety of professional forums. Even beyond the immediate projects and contractual concerns, the incident became a case study in personal branding under pressure. Industry experts analyzed how Meghan's carefully curated public image intersected with professional endeavors and audience expectations. Her story highlighted the precarious nature of celebrity influence in a digital age, where perception is both instantaneous and enduring. Every interview, social media post, and public appearance became a potential focal point for scrutiny, and the Netflix fallout illustrated how quickly public favor can shift when trust is called into question. Ultimately, the fallout within Hollywood was multifaceted, affecting financial interests, creative decisions, professional relationships, and personal reputations. It was a moment that underscored the interconnectedness of celebrity, media, and commerce, and the speed with which a high-profile individual could transition from celebrated figure to subject of controversy. For Meghan Markle, the industry's response was a tangible demonstration that even the most lucrative opportunities could vanish overnight when questions of authenticity arise, leaving both her career trajectory and personal brand in uncertain territory.